So we'll talk now about what's new with the documentation. I'd like to just give an overview of some of the things that have changed in recent toolkit versions. I'll go back a little bit further to like last year's DITA-OT day. So it's not just 2.2 that I'm talking about. So let's take a first look at what's new. If you haven't seen them yet so far, I recommend the release notes for the 2.2 release. There's a long list of things that have been changed there, so take a look at that at your leisure. Chris touched on some of them this morning, and there's a few other little Easter eggs there for people to discover. We'll go back and discuss those in a moment. One of the things that's new, relatively, compared to last year, is that the documentation of the DITA-Open Toolkit has been split out into separate sub-repositories. And we did that for several different reasons, but one of them was the hope that people who use the DITA-Open Toolkit, many of you are technical authors. We thought that it might be a little bit less intimidating if you could just focus on the documentation without having to check out lots of Java code to submit a fix for a little typo that you found somewhere in the documentation. So that makes it a little bit easier. It's a tiny little repository, and that's pulled back into the main. I'm not. Now I am. Okay, wonderful. That's better, yes, good. So the documentation repository itself now lives in its own location, makes it easier to check things out and commit changes or suggest changes. It also has the advantage that we have a separate issue tracker now for the documentation. So if in your working with the DITA-Open Toolkit you discover that there's something wrong with the documentation, perhaps missing, or something that's just not correct, you can file a bug directly for the documentation, and we'll try to attend to that. So that's one important thing, is that you don't need to be afraid of all the scary Java code and XSLT. If that's something that intimidates you, you can just look at the DITA code that you're familiar with. One of the other things that's new is something that Radu talked about earlier. And through Radu's suggestion, we now have the opportunity to generate a list of parameters that are supported by the plugins that are included in a certain installation of the toolkit, including the distribution package. So what we do now is there's a build process that goes through and scans through the list of integrated plugins and reads the plugin XML file for each of those and reads the parameters that are included in that file and compiles a list of topics for the documentation directly from there. So we've had a bunch of issues in the past where someone pointed out that parameter X doesn't appear in the documentation because someone forgot to add it. And so I can't promise that that will never happen again, but it should be less likely now. That should make things a little bit easier, and I'll just switch here to the project website where the documentation also lives. So I think most of you are probably already familiar with this, but there's a documentation menu up here, and that has links to recent documentation versions. We don't go all the way back. The old history is still on the SourceForge site, but recent toolkits are here. So you can select the version that you're interested in, and we're looking at the 2.2 version now. And here there's a new top-level entry here alongside, which we call the parameter reference. And there are several subtopics there. One of them is the list of DITA-OT parameters. And those of you that are familiar with these topics from the past may be missing the name of a small insect there. We've called them ant parameters in the past, and they are, but these same parameters also work when you're passing them to the DITA command. So we decided that the word ant needn't necessarily appear here, but these are still the parameters that you know and love. So now when you look for a particular output format, we have the common parameters that apply to all of them. There are some that are specific to HTML, and then it gets a little bit more specific where HTML5 and XHTML have some, and some things like HTML5 have a couple of parameters that nobody else has. So we'll come back to that in a moment. The other thing that's new and fresh is that the site that we were just looking at has now the ability to search the documentation. which is something that people have requested a lot in the past. That of course, you have the local installation within your toolkit distribution that has various versions of the documentation, either the PDF, the CHM file for those of you that live on Windows, and the other HTML-generated output formats that are there. But a lot of people end up using the project website to just view the latest online version of the documents. And there we never had an option to search. So we've just added one now that'll allow you to just quickly search that. So it's just basically nothing exciting, just a little search field up in the top. But if we were to now enter something there and we wanted to learn about our, I don't know, something, let's say, where does the word, we knew that those new grammars were included somewhere, but I don't know exactly where. That'll open just a site-specific search, and we get a topic, one result, the DITA 1.3 support topic, and if we go there, we'll find out more about that. So that makes it a little easier. We're still not quite on the level of some other search options, but that should make things a bit easier than they have been in the past. There's a caveat there that search field is hardwired to search the latest version of the documentation right now. The results would be a bit confusing if we were to return the results from all of the different documentation versions, and we decided that that probably wouldn't be so helpful for you if you're looking for something new and you're getting the 1.5.2 version of the documents, so we've excluded that. You can refine the search in the results page if you would like to search a different version, so that's easy enough to change. And another thing that may be of interest to many is the HTML5 output that has been introduced with version 2.2 of the toolkit is something that we're using now for the default distribution that we deliver. So if you're familiar with this, the old talk.js output, that now looks like this instead. So it's basically HTML5. It's quite similar to what you've seen on the project website that we were just looking at. It's something that Jarno developed there where we have a table of contents on the side. It's not a frame set. It's extracted into a HTML5 nav element, which is the semantically right way of doing it. And you can now navigate through there, and you have several options that allow you to decide whether you want just the table of contents that includes the current topic and its parents and siblings, or whether you want a full table of contents. You can choose that when you generate the output, but we've decided that that would be a good default for the documentation distribution that is included in the distribution builds. So now when you look in the doc folder there, you'll see this instead of your old friend talk.js. So what else? There's a couple of things that we're still working on, of course. We have limited resources in the documentation, like for the toolkit. This is an open source project, and we do this in our spare time. We've still got some catching up to do. I have realized as I've begun to support the team on this that it's kind of hard to keep up with Jarno. He's really fast. He makes a lot of changes, and that's great, which is good for the toolkit. Keeping up with him as the sole documentation person is sometimes a challenge, but I'm trying as best I can to keep in step with him. And all of you in the room can help me with that. So if you have the ability to contribute something to the documentation, I'd appreciate it. We can talk about that afterward in the break. But there's a few things we're looking at, we have on the list that we definitely like to include. So one thing that has been re-added to the documentation is some information about migrating. In past releases, information about what has changed in the toolkit and what you might need to look at as you migrate your customizations to older toolkit versions to the latest, that always lived in the release notes. And then the release notes got changed from one version to the next. And if you had been sleeping or didn't have time, you may not have gone along with each of those steps. So if you now find yourself looking at your DITA-OT 1.5 installation and trying to figure out how to get to 2.2, there's a lot of steps to go through. And rather than have you look for all of those old release notes, we've put them all together in a migration section of the developer reference. So you can see what changed from 1.5 to 1.6, 1.6 to 1.7, and what you might need to look at in your own customizations to catch up. That said, I haven't made it to 2.0 yet. So there's still more there to be added about migrating customizations to version 2, to 2.1, to 2.2, but that's coming, it's on the radar. Another topic that's still missing in the documentation is an idea that has been introduced in recent toolkit versions that you can configure a lot of toolkit behavior using properties files. So as opposed to Ant scripts that contain a bunch of properties, you can actually use local properties files that live alongside your source content and pass properties in at runtime. So that's something that is not well described in the documentation yet. We're aware of that and would like to add it soon. Some of the sample build scripts and things that are in there are a little old, and as the best practices have evolved, and Robert talked about that today with the start command and our friend Ant, we need to revisit some of those examples to modernize what we're suggesting as a good way of calling the toolkit, so we'll look at that soon. A couple of other plans that we have include some more auto-generated documentation. So like the parameters, there is also documentation for the various extension points that the toolkit contains. And we have also received a few reports here and there of why isn't this extension point referenced and mentioned, and I don't know how to use it, but it sounds like it might be good for me. So that's on our list. We'd like to auto-generate the list of extension points, which should then surface any issues with the existing explanations. They probably have a little description somewhere. That might not be good, but once we get them all in one place, we can then review those descriptions and make sure that they make sense. So that's something we'll look at. In DITA-1.3, in the upcoming specification, the XML Mentioned Domain has been added, and many people are excited about that. And of course, in the DITA-OT documentation, we make reference to all sorts of XML elements and attributes and things like that. So in new content, I've been using that over the past couple of months where XML things are mentioned, but I have not yet gone through the entire toolkit documentation to done. Yes, okay. So we'll do that soon. There's a bit more work that we want to do on the CSS and the HTML5 output that we're generating. So as the HTML5 plugin itself is enhanced in upcoming toolkit versions, we'll do some more with the documentation there as well. So that's just a baseline what we have right now. So I'm just coming to a close here, but I'd like to just call attention to a couple of ways that you can help. The latest docs themselves live on DITA-OT.org along with the rest of the project information. If there's something you find there in the documentation, please let us know. You can create an issue to call it to our attention. There's a list of open issues there that you can check to get a sense of whether anyone else has noticed this yet. There's some contribution guidelines that give you a sense of what to do to actually contribute code. So you can create a pull request if you know how to do that in Git. That'll make it much easier for us to incorporate the changes that you're suggesting and to review them. If you don't know how to do that and the word pull request sounds vaguely obscene or unfamiliar, don't worry about it. If you would like to contribute something to the documentation, would like to help us, but don't know how Git works, that shouldn't prevent you entirely from doing it. We can probably help nonetheless. So don't let that be a hindrance. That's it for this lightning talk.
Thank you, Roger.